Hi there. In this tutorial I'm going to talk about hair. So I'm just going to go through how to create a hair particle system and how to adjust some of the basic parameters and how to manipulate the hair as well. So you can see I've got a little creature here and I've got a demonstration of a number of different elements. Here he's got very long hair that's being ruffled by the wind. Here it's slightly shorter and you can see it's rattling around a bit. And I'll talk about the specific nodes that are good to use for shading the hair, as well as how to set up a pattern on the hair like this. So to begin with, here is our basic little character. It's a very basic character that you can see I've got animated here. And we're going to give him some hair. The texture on him is not relevant, it's just something I decided to put on there. So if we go to particles and we click on particle system, I'm doing this in cycles by the way, and change to hair particles, you can see we get hair strands and they're quite long to begin with, and we can straight away adjust them here. So if we go down to say 0.2 for hair length, now we've got a more reasonable length hair. To begin with, they will generally take on the material that you've got on your object, and it's also only showing a preview of the hair, so obviously it's not currently moving the way hair would move, and it's much thinner than it really is. So there's 1,000 hair particles here. So if we want the hair to move, we're going to need to use hair dynamic. But let's look at what that's currently looking like in the rendered view. So not much different to how it was in the preview. And you can see the hair is basically the color of the skin in this case. So if I go to my character, you can see I've got a number of different materials here, and I've got a fur-based material. If I open up another window and we'll go to the shader editor, I was experimenting with various things, so I can get rid of this one now, and we can have a look at what that is. So I wanted hair that wasn't the same all the way across. So I've got a texture coordinate coming in here, just a generated one, and I've got a noise texture, and that's relatively low frequency, a low scale of 7, feeding into 2 different color ramps. And the reason I'm doing that is because although I've got the same noise pattern going into each of them, I'm able to select different parts of the noise between these 2 color ramps. I've done something similar on the skin of the critter. So if I apply the hair color to the creature itself, so I'm going to go into edit mode, select all the vertices and just assign the fur texture. Now you can see what that really looks like down here. So I've got 2 different colors, and if I adjust my color ramps, you can see this modifies it, and I can completely change them like that if I want to. So what I'm doing is I'm taking the basic noise pattern from this one up here. You can see I can change it a bit more there, and I'm using this math node to divide the value of one by the value of the other, and then using the output of that to basically mix between 2 different colors here. I could undoubtedly have done it by just putting colors into this color ramp, but sometimes just structuring things this way helps when you're thinking about it. So that's my base hair color, and then I'm feeding that into a hair BSDF, which just gives you a lot of the feel of hair. And you can see you've got reflection and transmission options in here. I think the transmission gives you literally a sort of translucent hair, which you might want, but I think the reflection gives a nicer look to the hair. Obviously not quite right for the surface that I've got here, so I'll go back to my creature and just assign his original material there, which looks better. But how do we select this material, this fur material, as the one we want? So we now go back to our particle system, and under render you can see we've got an option for material. Currently that says critter base, which is the skin material, but I can click in here and I can select critter fur material. And now you can see we've got that different color. So that's fine. Now you can have the hair work in various different ways. It'll generally be smooth and curvy regardless, but you may want to turn on B-spline here. Now bear in mind this will add a certain amount of computation to being able to render and calculate the movement of the fur. But we can turn that on, and the number of steps, if you like, the number of handles in the curve that creates this B-spline, a B-spline being a very gradual curve. And I'll turn that off for now. Timing will affect essentially the size of the hair, and you can add a random in there. If you want the hair to be different lengths, you can see we've got some variation in lengths here. If you like, 1 is 100% of the size of the hair that we say. Typically, once you set your hair up, you're going to want to add children. So that is basically, rather than having to put 2 million or whatever in here, you have a number and then you multiply that number. So you've got two different ways of doing that. You can say simple or interpolated. If every hair strand is identical, then you may as well use simple. However, generally you do have a certain amount of randomness in it, and you may have different shapes in the hair if you add some of the other settings that we're going to put in. So you're probably better off using interpolated. Interpolated will take a couple of hair strands and then add a number of other strands between them that vary between the first strand and the second strand. So if you imagine you had a really long hair and then nearby it you had a very short hair, and you said add one extra hair for each pair of hairs that you've got, one child hair, and you put it as interpolated, it will be halfway between the first hair and the second hair. But of course when you add more than that, it will be a variation between that. So interpolated gives you a more sensible and gradual change between one parent hair and the next. So we'll add that, and by default the display amount for the preview is multiplied by 10 and the render amount is multiplied by 100. That's a good starting point, but just be aware of that. So if you've got 1,000 up here, when you render it, you're going to be rendering 100,000 hairs. So there's some other options in here which I'll get into. I always like to click long hair and it will just randomize it slightly more. These settings apply to the children only, and you can set it up so the children's position and angles are influenced by these settings. So if I put clumping on, for example, you can see that the children hairs, in this case, are all pointing towards their parents at the top. Or I can go down to a negative number, and now what they're doing is the tops of them are pointing away from the parents, and it's the base that's close to the parent. So often used when you're creating things like grass simulations and so on. And then the shape of it will obviously affect the way that clump is structured. So you can see we're getting sort of quite pointy structures to more angular structures. So I'll just set that back to default, and you can add a noise amount in there as well to give you some variation. Roughness will give you a randomness. So currently 0, it's uniform, they're completely uniform, but as I start to turn that up, you'll see the angles of the children start to go all over the place. And it doesn't take very much to do that. If you're going to use this, I would say use quite a small number, because you only want a small variation, you don't want too much, depending on what you're trying to simulate. Hair tends to be very, very uniform on a small scale, but doesn't have to be, of course. And then kink, you can have different kinds of kink, so we can put curl in there, and you can see he's got slightly curly hair essentially, and you can affect the amplitude here. So if we go to 0.05, it'll be less extreme and perhaps looks a bit more appropriate now. So you can see he's got curly hair instead of straight hair. I'll set that back to nothing. So then we come down to hair shape, and this is the shape of the individual strands. Now in preview mode you can't see this, all you'll see is representative paths. You have to be in rendered mode to be able to see the individual strand shapes. So you've got the diameter at root and at tip. Now it says meters, but I wouldn't worry too much about that. Obviously what I'm showing here is as it gets out towards the end of the strand, it's basically coming to a tip. Now if this was mown grass, it's very unlikely it would actually be sharp at the tip like that. So you might put something more like 0.1 at the tip, which sort of shows, I'll try and see if we can see it in here. Well, if I put 1, for example, there, I know it says meters, but don't worry too much about that, and I take off that, you can see they now all come out and they're exactly the same thickness all the way along. But you might go perhaps more like that, so that's essentially sharp. As I said, don't worry too much about the units it's using, and you can adjust it like that. I think hair looks better to actually be sharp, but if you click this close tip, what it will do, of course, is make the tip pointy regardless. So if I click that there, you can see, in fact I'll untick it, I'll put this back at 1 meter. You can see it's just like a ribbon, and then I'll click close tip, and you can see shortly before the end it suddenly closes in and gives you that pointy structure. Perhaps quite good for a blade of grass, although we're all moving over to using geometry nodes these days for that kind of thing. And you can play with the strand shape here to affect how that curve works. But I think just setting the tip to 0 is fine and gives you a finer hair look. And you've got a scale here, so if you play with that, you can have thicker or thinner hair. So you can see that's much thicker strands now. So let's have a look at what that looks like at the moment rendered. So that's going to be the view we'll render, and we'll give that a go. So there it is. He's actually quite dark because it's a dark hair anyway, and I think I might brighten that up a little bit just so that it's easier to see. But you see, that's a lot of hair, so we probably don't need quite that much. I'm going to drop his child hairs at render to 50, so that's 50,000 hairs, and then we'll just come up to fur, and I think we'll lighten that up a little bit just to make it easier to see. Okay, so the next thing is we'll come out of preview mode and we'll have a look at what we've got here. So you'll notice the hair is not behaving like hair, or he's got an awful lot of hair gel on because it's not moving at all. To achieve that, we need to turn on hair dynamic. So I'm going to turn that on here, and I'm not going to change anything, and we'll just see what happens. And initially it's gone berserk, as you can see, so that's obviously not what we want. And that'll be because I've got some old cache files hanging around. So we'll delete all bakes, and then we'll just say bake. And I've just baked 100 frames here, as you can see down here. And if I let him walk forward, and I'm going to just limit the play to 100 frames now. And you can see it's behaving a bit more naturally. I've got it playing skip framing at the moment to give us the speed, but if I turn this down to play every frame, it won't play at real speed, but it will allow us to see exactly what's going on. And now you can see the hair is moving more naturally with his movement. You can see it's waving around with gravity. So that's a very simple initial stab at creating some somewhat realistic hair. So next problem, before we go any further on the dynamics, is that he's got hair coming out of his eyes. It's more visible now that we've got the hair flopping down. One of the ways we deal with that is to go to vertex groups. You can see I've got a number of vertex groups defined here, but most of those are to do with the armature that I put in here. But I've got one called fur, so if I select that one, and you can see that I've selected all the areas that I want to be covered in fur. Probably didn't need to select the base of his feet, but deselected the area around his eyes. So that's not selected by that vertex group. And obviously you just select an area and you just say assign and give it a name. So the name is fur. But currently my particle system is not using that vertex group. So if I go to my particle system, I'm going to delete the bake just because it'll get in the way, and then come on down here under vertex groups, and then under density I'm going to select fur, and now you can see there is no hair coming through his eyes. Now if you want to, you can use weight painting, and you can see for that vertex group there is a little bit of grading of the weight painting around his eyes, and you can use that to affect the length of the fur as well, so that rather than it going from fur to no fur, you can have it getting shorter as it approaches this point where there is no fur. The density will drop off as well if you have it in density. If I click this, by the way, it will invert it, and we only have fur coming from his eyes, which is probably not a good idea. So I messed up his eyes there when I changed the material, so I'll just correct that. So there's our little creature, and if we give that a render, because he's off camera at this point, I'll just move my camera over to bring him into shot, and then we'll give that a render. We've got quite large hair there, you can see. Obviously I did finer hair originally. I've still got a slight setting on the strand shape there. We'll go to 0.2 for the root, which will basically make the hair finer, and then we'll give that another render. And although he's still slightly bold, you can see that's a much finer hair now, still rendering. So you can see it there. So we can also turn on advanced settings at the top, and that just gives us a few more controls. So in my settings, I ended up with about 3,000 base hairs. Segments is again how many point over which the hair can bend. So more of these will give you more flowing hair, but will also add to the computation required. Generally I stick with the default. You can decide whether to emit from faces or from vertices. I'm just going to go back to the beginning of the animation. So there they are. So I actually used vertices. There's quite a lot of vertices on this object, and I used the modifier stack. So that basically means if you've got something like a subdivision surface on your object, it will use the additional vertices created by that as options for where it can instance a hair strand. Obviously this is to do with the quality of the simulation. Higher number, better quality. Again, it will take longer to bake that. So you just need to try with the default first and see if that's satisfactory. If it seems a little unnatural, you can try increasing that a little bit, but bear in mind it will add to the time it takes to bake. not render. It doesn't affect the render time. So collisions will obviously relate to things like this. I've got this plane here, so you can set the floor plane, for example, as particle collision, and then that will allow the hair to rest on it and things like that. But you may find the baking time for that isn't worth what you get from it. You generally can't see if the hair is falling through the object or not, but in theory you do need to, if you have a ground plane, to set that to a collision if the hair is going to touch, and then this sets the quality of those collisions and any distance. So there's one of the complications. There will be a distance within which the hair detects a collision, and this is how you set that distance. Impulse clamping you use if you're starting to get errors like hairs doing strange things and flying off. So vertex mass is how heavy the hair is, if you like. The default is 0.3 of a kilogram. I actually set mine to 0.1, so much lighter hair. And I set the stiffness down a bit as well to 0.25. We'll see how that affected in a moment. The damping I left at 0.5. So if we come back to the cache now, make sure we've deleted the bakes and then click bake. By the way, you need to have saved your simulation in order to be able to bake. So we'll just bake a few frames there. By the way, a little reminder about the settings for the cache. Make sure this number is at least as long as your animation. I'm only actually using 100 frames at the moment, so this only needs to be 100. But if your animation is a lot longer than the default of 250 frames, don't forget to increase this. And by the way, this will bake as you play the animation, but it's hard to see what's going on if you do it like that. So let's see what that's done. So you can see we've got a little more natural movement on the hair now. If we render that, and there you go, you can see we've got a nice flop to the hair, and that's looking like a reasonably convincing hair simulation now. You can see there are other options to play with here. So you can affect air drag, so that's how much the hair will stay in place as the source object moves around, so you can affect that here. Velocity will actually affect the size of the hair as well, and also you can give it an offset, so it will tend to shoot out at a particular direction. And then under field weights, you can determine how the different fields affect it, such as gravity. So you might want the hair just to float around without being affected by gravity, and you can turn that down to 0. Or you may have some wind forces. So a little bit about wind forces. You can add a force field which might be a wind force. Now you generally find these need to be quite strong to affect your hair. And obviously I'm just going to point that something like this. Doesn't really matter where it is unless you have a fall off identified. And obviously I will need to rebake to have this affect it. But I'm going to put this wind force up quite high, so let's put a strength of 100 on that. You can see it's stronger because the little circles have extended out, and then we'll come back, delete the bake and rebake. And this is where you can start to see how once you've got a simulation like this, it starts to take longer and longer because you're doing more with it. And one approach to that is actually to reduce the number of hairs that you're simulating until you've got a general idea of whether the dynamics is working and so on, and then add them all back in again. You can obviously turn off children, which is one of the things, but children tends to just affect render time. It doesn't affect simulation time. So the main thing that affects simulation time is the number of base particles that you have. So we start that off now. You can see that's a very, very strong wind. It's actually pushing the hairs into the body and they've gone out behind him. So obviously, if you needed a wind that was that strong, you might need to change your settings for the hair. So if we delete the bake, and we could adjust stiffness, for example. If we put that up to 1 and rebake, we'll just stop it there. You can see that's pulled it back slightly, but it's still struggling. You notice very straight hair now. So if we delete the bake, we'll go back to 0.25 and we'll increase this number. So I'll put this one up to 1, which is under the hair dynamics setting, and bake. And you can see with that setting, essentially the root of the hair is stiff, but then the rest of the hair is allowed to move somewhat. But obviously it's a very, very strong wind, so it's tending not to move an awful lot, it's just going straight out. So what you need to do is obviously adjust the strength of the wind and the stiffness that you identify here. Pin goal strength of 1 is actually very high. Normally you'd have somewhere in between 0 and 1. With 1 it's probably not going to really move very much at all. And you can see I've set that now to 0.25 and it's just about there. The hair's still getting blown into the object slightly. And then I can turn the strength of the wind down to a more reasonable number. Let's try 35 and perhaps add a little noise into it as well, and then rebake. And now you can see we're starting to get a more reasonable effect. Hair's still fairly stiff and you just need to play around with your values to get it right. So as you can see, the noise in the wind is giving some ripples on his fur. And then the last little thing really to show about hair, I'm just going to turn off some of these other objects to get them out of the way. And I'm going to turn off hair dynamics, and I'm going to delete all bakes, and we'll remove the wind modifier. I think we've got our hair back there. So this is no longer dynamic hair, this is just fixed hair. But there's another editing mode. We select our hair object, and you notice we've got a particle edit mode. So if I select that, and then we can look at our object, and we have a number of different tools here. So one of them that we might want to use is comb. And as you might expect, you can just select areas and comb the hair in a particular direction. And give him a bit of a hairstyle there. Just comb it upward. We'll still get the children being generated as you would expect them to be, but they'll now use the new shape that we're giving it by combing. So I'm just using some fairly random combing here. Perhaps that would go that way around that eye, and that would go that way around the eye. I'm just trying to make sure it's something that's visible when we render. So this is simulating literally what it would be like to put a comb through his hair, but there are other options as well, so we can smooth it. So obviously it's taking some of the kinks that we've introduced by combing it, making it much smoother obviously. We can also increase the length of the hair here. You can see I'm dragging that hair out from its root and it's getting longer. And we can cut the hair. So if we had some hair that was perhaps encroaching on his eyes or whatever, we can cut it away like that. Let's put that back. And we can affect the hair like this with weight painting. So we can here weight paint the hair, and there are some options to do special things depending on the weight. We can puff it out a little bit here. Once you've done that, that's his hairstyle as it were. So there we go, come back into object mode and you can see much thicker hair there, and there you can see. Note that if you try to render while still in edit mode, hair edit mode, the hair won't show up at all. You can see we've combed his hair up into a bit of a style there. So I hope you found that interesting. If you did, let me know. If you've got any questions about any of this, please put them in the comments below. I will upload the original file for my Patreon supporters to use. Otherwise, I will see you in the next tutorial. Thanks a lot.